So today is the 5th, as I said, Feedback Informed Treatment and Deliberate Practice Meetup, and we will be recording this as we have in the previous times, and Cynthia and I will edit it and then make it available via my blog. All of the information that we'll be talking about today you can find at scottdmiller.com. Have to have the D in between Scott and Miller. I've been blogging about every 7 to 10 days. And if you look at the most current blog posts that have been done since the outbreak of COVID-19, all of the recordings are there, the first 3, and I will be posting the 4th tomorrow. And thanks to an arrangement with Mark Holtz at ceunits.com, you can even now earn continuing education credits for listening to the broadcast. That's not something we do. Mark has arranged that on his own website. You can find the link when you watch the video in the description of the video or via my website.
For now, I'm going to turn off my video and mute myself so that you can all have the Scott's full presence there. All right.
Thanks, Cynthia.
Okay.
So once again, thanks for joining us, and thanks also for submitting the questions in advance. That helps me do some preparation so I'm not scrambling at the last minute to have material that you'll find relevant and meaningful. I'm just going to take the questions in order as they came up, and we'll get through as many as we can before the hour is up. And if there's still demand, maybe we'll do a 6th feedback informed meetup in the future. So here are questions that came from a number of people: Kate Michaud, Piyali Chakrabarti, Natalie Datillo, Michael Sorbinski, and Audrey D'Souza. They said in their question when they were registering that they were interested in anything at all about FIT, but in particular how to use the ORS and SRS practical strategies and tools. Once again, tons of information since the middle of March on my website about how to use the measures in a virtual environment. Thanks to Cynthia, Brooke Matthews, Stacy Bancroft, and others, we have provided a ton of information about using the tools in a virtual environment. So make sure you go to the site and watch the videos, lots of helpful how-to information. If you're wondering about how to use FIT, sort of practical strategies about how to use FIT, let's take a step back and think about why FIT. And the reason is that there has been a quest for the last 50 years to improve the outcome of the work that we do as mental health professionals. The primary way that we've tried to accomplish that is by emulating the medical model. The medical model with its emphasis on diagnosis and then specific treatments, that is, treatments that are remedial to the disorder or diagnosis that the client presents with. For most of the last 4 decades, that is the view that has held sway. And yet, when we look at the outcome data over that period of time, we see little to no improvement in the overall outcome or efficacy of psychotherapy. So we've had a mushroom cloud of new methods. The DSM has continued to expand from its earlier and more slim versions, and yet the overall effect sizes, as I say, have not improved. So how could we get better at what we do? Because that's the heart that most psychotherapists have. They really want to help the people that they work with, and it just so happens that's the heart of FIT. And it's based on 2 key findings from the treatment literature. Again, this is in response to those questions about how to use the ORS, and more importantly, why should we be measuring our outcomes? The first thing to think about in terms of improving our outcomes is to know when change typically occurs in treatment. And as far back as 1986, so over 3 decades ago, Ken Howard at Northwestern University published an interesting study where he was looking at when did people begin to experience improvement. And as you can see from the graphic on the left of this particular slide, much of that change. Now, and remember the time period, 1986, the field was still deeply wedded to this idea that more treatment was always better treatment and longer term treatments were better than shorter term treatments. That's all well and good. That was the way it was from our perspective. But the clients said, when we measured their outcomes, all the way back in 1986, that 35 to 65% were measurably improved within the first 7 visits. The point of this wasn't that we would all be doing brief therapy. In fact, the distinction between brief and long-term therapy has always been one that's eluded me. If you went to the surgeon and you needed heart surgery, for example, they probably wouldn't ask you, would you like the long surgery or the short one? Because your primary question would be, what's most effective for me given my condition? The point here is that when 2 people are paired up, one therapist and one client, that you should be able to tell sooner rather than later whether or not that pairing is actually working for them. If you look at the graphic on the right, this was a study done by Scott Baldwin several decades later, looking at when change happened in therapy. And unlike Howard's graph, Scott broke out the graph into quintiles, meaning that he was looking at when clients change given how they present. We know, for example, that clients who are functioning better actually experience improvement sooner, and those who are functioning more poorly at intake might take a little bit longer. In Scott's graph, if you watch my cursor on the screen, you could see that the clients that were the most severe in his sample, that's this top line, dashes and dots, half of the change that should have happened in that sample happened by the 12th week or the 12th visit, which means that even with our most dysfunctional clients, those who are struggling the most, you should begin to see change within the first 12 visits, or the probability of improvement with that particular pairing is no longer on the incline. It's leveling off and decreasing. So outcome was one of the key factors that we were looking at as a way of improving the results of treatment. We needed to find out, were we helping or not? And if not, begin to change something about what we were doing. Well, what could we change? In our field, the answer has always been change the method, change the model. And each new model that comes out promises to be an advance over the last model, or a nuanced view of that old model. Well, the research literature indicates that the model of treatment that a clinician practices contributes a very small amount to the efficacy of that treatment, less than 1% of the variability in treatment outcomes. We've spent 99% of our time in training learning something that accounts for 1% of the variance in treatment outcome. What could we focus on instead? And as hackneyed as it sounds, when you turn to the research literature and look at the factors which really affect outcome, one of the most potent contributors is the therapeutic relationship, reflected in literally thousands of findings now in the treatment literature. A robust contributor is the therapeutic relationship or outcome. And the nice thing about this is that we seem to have pretty good agreement amongst researchers about what constitutes a good working alliance or relationship. Number one, are we working on what the client wants? Number two, do the means and methods that we're using fit with the client's values and beliefs, their preferences? Number three, does the work in total fit with and square with how the client sees themselves? And number four, that middle leg in the alliance tool there, the client's view of the relationship. In other words, do they experience us as warm, genuine, respectful, and empathic? So these two core findings, the outcome and the alliance, led our team to start thinking maybe we should seek information from the clients on a routine basis to figure out, are we helping? And if not, what in the relationship could we address in order to improve the chances of success? So in terms of using these ideas, we developed a couple of simple tools. And the first tool was the outcome rating scale. And the truth is that initially our team didn't start with the ORS. In fact, we began with a tool known as the Outcome Questionnaire 45, Mike Lambert's tool. What was the reason for that? That was really one of the only clinically validated tools available at the time when we began experimenting in the mid-1990s. Our issue was that many of the clients we worked with, in particular mine here in the Chicago area, had difficulty with literacy. And we ended up spending a huge amount of time reading the items and helping the client understand how to answer them. So we began thinking about how could we have a more feasible measure. The outcome rating scale was born out of that. It contains 4 items. Individually, how you're doing. Relationally, in your close relationships, how you're doing. Number 3, socially, how are you doing? And then an overall catch-all item that is intended to not only capture the 3 prior items, but anything else in the client's life or experience that might contribute to their overall sense of well-being. What's critical when you start using FIT is that you create a culture in the room where clients feel safe in providing the feedback that you're looking for. And so with the ORS, I always advise that clinicians take time upfront in that first visit to explain the rationale and the purpose. And much of what I've just said, I say to my clients, you know, I work a little differently than you may be accustomed to. And here's what we know from the research literature. We know that if what I know how to do is going to make a difference in your life, that you should begin to feel that difference sooner rather than later. Generally, that means within a handful of visits rather than months or years. If what we do works, I will continue to work with you as long as you wish and you find it helpful. However, what's really critical is knowing if what I'm doing isn't helping, because knowing that allows me an opportunity to alter the services. How soon? Well, within 3 or 4 visits. If what we're doing isn't working, then you and I should have a chat and figure out, is there something different that I could do? If we get up to 6 to 8 visits and it's still not working, then perhaps we need to think about who else and where else might you avail yourself of some help. And if we get out to 8 to 12 visits and something is still not right, still not making progress, then maybe what I need to do is help you get to someplace else or someone else that will provide the help that you need. And we've found in our experience in training therapists to use the measures that most of the mistakes that are made right there in the failure to create that culture of feedback. In some ways, you can't take too much time when introducing the measures to the client. Now that's the ORS. That's the measure of outcome or progress. And this particular scale is a measure of well-being. The second scale, of course, is the session rating scale. Again, this wasn't the measure that we started with. Initially, we used 3. We used the Working Alliance Inventory from Horvath, an additional several questions called the Theory of Change measure, and then a 10-item measure developed primarily by Lynn Johnson, a supervisor and a colleague of mine, called the Session Rating Scale. In time, we researched the scale and we were able to identify 4 questions that correlated highly with the rest of those more lengthy measures. When we give this measure, we're assessing the classic definition of the alliance: goals, means, client preferences, and my role in the therapy process. And once again, and I think perhaps especially true with the SRS, I've got to create an atmosphere where the client feels safe in speaking up and speaking back to me about the work that we've done together. So I'm going to give this at the end of the visit, and I'm going to say, you know, as I said at the beginning, I work a little differently than you may be accustomed to. The reason I say that is, in my work and practice, I rarely meet clients who've not been in treatment before. And I want to draw a distinction between the way I work and perhaps what they've experienced from others. And then I pause for a moment and I say, I'm not interested in perfect scores. And this is something I copied directly from a top performing clinician that we learned a great deal from about deliberate practice. She's based in the UK. Her name is Wendy Amy. I say, I'm not interested in perfect scores. A 10 out of 10 doesn't mean much to me. Life's not perfect, neither am I. So if there's anything, even small, so small that you might be tempted to think it's not worth bringing up, I'd like you to bring it up, mark the form accordingly. We can talk about it and decide together how to move forward. that's because your feedback is critical to our success in working together. And then I restate these rationale at the beginning and the end of each visit before I administer the scale. That may seem like a lot of extra work. In general, it only takes me about a minute or two to introduce and get the scales scored, and then I'm showing them this in the graph from visit to visit. Cynthia, how are we doing?
We're doing good. Audrey has a question, and she's saying that it makes sense theoretically to refer a client out of therapy if it's not working.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's not always possible in an agency setting and may not be looked upon favorably.
Yeah.
And is wondering how to navigate such situations, and also wondering if there is space to have conversations with clients and review what's not working and address the issues instead of relying on referring them out.
Okay, this is a really important question. And let's go back to this slide and look at the steps we're taking before we're talking about referring people out. I'm telling clients, please give me feedback. At session 3 or 4, at the latest, if there's no progress or if there's some deterioration, I'm talking with the client about what we can do differently. I might invite a colleague into the room. I can also have the client and I visit with a colleague and explain what we've been doing in the work and see if their questions help open up different possibilities. If that doesn't work and we get up to sessions 6 to 8, remember the probability of success, the longer we go, is getting less and less. In fact, Jeb Brown, as well as Wolfgang Lutz out of Germany, have found that 9 visits, no change, 90% chance of failure, regardless of how long the therapy continues. So there is an ethical obligation to begin thinking about what steps are going to take in the absence of client progress. And the last step I'm taking, 8 to 12 weeks in the work that I'm doing. And by this time, remember, we've measured at each session with the client and we've had conversations with them. Then I'm talking about moving them on to someone else. Now, you ask about in agency settings, it may be frowned upon. And we're going to talk about this in a minute when we talk about implementation. Because in many agencies, what's happening is there is now an outcome mandate from Joint Commission and other certifying bodies that says you must measure outcome. And as a result, I'm getting lots of requests to send agencies the measures. The problem with that is that it's not really, FIT really isn't about the measures. FIT is about what you do in response to client feedback. And as you say, Audrey, there are lots of barriers to following client feedback. Some very practical, like who do we send these people to? In addition to it being frowned upon by your colleagues, those have to be addressed before you begin using the measures. Let me say it again. Those have to be addressed. Otherwise, clinicians who have big hearts will keep clients who are not progressing. And those clients, as much as 25% of clients in typical community mental health outpatient agencies, absorb the lion's share of the resources. They continue to come, but they don't get better. The whole purpose of FIT is to challenge that way of thinking. FIT is really about changing agency culture. So I promise we're going to talk about how to implement this in a minute, because the agency culture has to change to accommodate what needs to happen in response to client feedback. Otherwise, we'll just keep seeing those clients even though we're not helping. Cynthia?
Very appropriate that you're talking about implementation right now, because Dan has a question, and there's also an anonymous person who has a question that are
both. An anonymous person.
He is very mysterious.
That person is responsible for many quotes online.
Anyway, both the questions are, I believe, are kind of related to implementation. Okay. Dan is asking, what if you're the only one who's interested in FIT in an agency that's already using an electronic medical record? And the anonymous attendee is asking, should we throw out the traditional intake and just focus on the ORS and SRS? What if the agency's policy revolves around getting a full background, usually obtained during an intake?
Yeah. So let's start with the last question because it's again related to implementation. And implementation in an agency setting really requires a concentrated effort on the part of management and staff because fit is far more than simply using the measurement tools. That implementation process includes 5 steps. And the first step you will see is not about using the measures. The first step is asking, what does it entail to be a fit agency? Is this even right for our context? So during that stage, we talk about creating an initial implementation team that explores fit, that visits other agencies and sees how they're doing fit, that reads the manuals together, and then considers, this is the important part, the traditions and culture at that agency and how fit might conflict with that. In time, that initial implementation team will be transformed into something we call the Transition Oversight Group, whose job it will be to resolve conflicts between what fit is telling us to do and agency tradition and policy. That's a critical step in the process, because if you don't do it, then all fit becomes is the staff doing more paperwork from visit to visit. Can an individual clinician do fit in an agency setting? I'm sure they can. But then the question is how are you going to resolve these kinds of conflicts where fit is telling you that what you're doing and who is doing it and where it's being done is not helpful to them? If agency policy tells you you can't transfer non-progressing cases to your colleagues first, and then outside the agency, that's going to create quite a dilemma. And how often will you need to transfer clients? Well, this is usually the thing when people first start hearing or learning about fit that gives them the most fright. And here's what we know. We know from randomized controlled trials of so-called evidence-based treatments that about 50% of clients who start in therapy achieve a reliable improvement with that method and seen by that particular therapist. Just take a moment, take a deep breath, and let that sink in. That means that half of the time, you working your way with that client initially won't help them. What happens when you introduce fit? Well, if the culture around you in the agency is supportive, meaning that it helps you use the measures, get feedback, and then act on that feedback from the client, that means changing what you're doing, going beyond the protocol, even moving a client from you to somebody else within the agency. If you're able to do that, then your outcome improves again by half, about another 25%. That leaves, no matter what you do, about 25% of the people that you and your agency will not help. What happens to those clients? Well, remember what I said. 25% of clients stick around for a long period of time and they don't get better, but they absorb huge amounts of costs. How much of it? The data indicate between 70 and 80% of the costs are absorbed by a very small percentage of the clients that just don't respond. How do we deal with this in an agency setting? Because it creates bottlenecks. We have programming. So we pass people through program. We're going to send you to the self-esteem group. We're going to send you to the depression group. We're going to send you to the trauma group. They go for a certain number of sessions. They graduate. They may not attend services for a brief period, but then they're back again because their problems really haven't been resolved because we're stuck inside that particular agency or box. So all of this needs to be explored at the beginning. What are the implications for fit within our agency? Because the culture is going to be rattled by what fit tells us to do. The key, however, is that once you have that transition oversight group in place, that kind of feedback that you're getting from your clients can be metabolized by the transition oversight group and come up with solutions. What are we going to do with the clients that are not getting better? Who are we going to send them to in the community? Or are there clients that we can simply say to, what we have to offer doesn't help, and we're not sure what to do after this? After exploration is installation, which means that you are putting training and structures in place. Again, generally we hop over the exploration phase. A couple people go to a workshop, we go back and we start to try it out. that kind of disjointed effort typically results in failure. And what do we know about implementation? We now have a growing body of evidence that says successful implementation takes between 3 and 7 years. Now, again, think about that for a minute. It probably, especially if you're new to fit, doesn't even make sense. How could doing these two measures take 3 to 7 years when Scott Miller can explain to you how to score them within 3 to 7 minutes? It's because, again, it's really not about the measures. It's about the feedback that you get and developing a culture that's supportive of that. We also know that failure in implementation, and how many fail? The majority fail. That's what the data say. Only between about 5 and 30% of implementation efforts, and not just with FIT, but with all evidence-based practices, they tend to fail. We know that that failure is more likely when the focus is on the intervention, the measures, and practitioners rather than organizational change. So there has to be that cultural element. We know that failure is more likely in terms of implementation when the training is off-site rather than live and on the job. And we also know that implementation failure is more likely when the practitioners and supervisors at the agency are held accountable rather than an implementation team and the manager. If we look at FIT implementations, we know a couple of things. We started in a way that's quite similar to, I think, a lot of agencies. In the initial research done back in the 2007, 2008, most trainings started with the measures, how to administer, how to score them, and they were 1 and 2 day trainings. In fact, in a recent meta-analysis that was done by a Danish researcher, he gathered together how much time was spent training clinicians in FIT. And on average, it was less than 6 hours. I'm telling you, you can't learn to do FIT in 6 hours because it's really not about the measures. So 1 and 2 day trainings are not very helpful. Instead, as I've said, emphasis should be placed on cultural change within the organization. You explore, and then you're going to pilot. The reason you're going to pilot at the agency is because you need to find out what problems are created by FIT and the feedback that the clients give us. This is what happens when you implement correctly. And Heidi Brotland's research out of Norway found that FIT took between 2.5 and 4 years to be successfully implemented. And yet when it was successfully implemented, the clients were 2.5 times more likely to achieve success. In the first 2 years of the implementation she studied, FIT made no difference whatsoever. So I'm not sure if I'm being discouraging here. I really want you to aim at an organizational change rather than simply the use of the tools. Cynthia?
Yeah, we've got questions coming in fast and furious here. Keith has a question about using ORS and SRS with families and how to handle discrepancies in scores among family members. And Terry has a question sort of along the same line, only slightly different, asking about if you could speak about using ORS and SRS with children and youth and the challenges with getting those children and youth to tell you when they aren't happy.
Okay, so let's stop there.
Okay.
And just talk about discrepancies in scores. And when you begin using the measures, you shouldn't forget what you know about doing clinical work. Instead, the client's answers to the questions simply help structure the conversation that follows. Clearly, if families are coming in, or even a couple are coming in, they're going to have differences. Now, all we do is have numbers. So however you choose to do your clinical work, those numbers can serve as reference points in the conversation. I can certainly give you some ideas about what I do, but again, we're talking here about how Scott Miller does therapy. And I would be careful about assuming that you can just borrow the way I do it if you don't have a similar point of view as regards how therapy unfolds and happens. I happen to be systemically trained. So when there are differences, I'm going to ask questions about those differences. Let me give you an example. A couple comes in and one person scores high and the other person scores low. Now I can highlight that difference by saying, what did you score, sir? And what did you score to the other person? Or I can try to build a bridge between the two of them. As a systemically trained person, as somebody who looks more towards positive rather than negative interactions, I can then say to one of the partners, for example, would you please rate how you think your partner feels they're doing? Let that sink in. Would you please rate how you think your partner's doing? And to the other person, would you please do the same? Rate how you think your partner's doing. And then I can have them reveal that score. And in so doing, very often what happens is the partner's rating of the other person's score is actually closer to their rated score. And I can highlight the similarities. So did you know that your partner really saw just how distressed you were? If there's a vast difference, then I can turn back to the person and I can say, what was it? What is it that your partner would know about you that would have her rate you similarly to the way you've rated yourself? So I'm simply using the measures as a way of doing therapy, using my systemic point of view and trying to build bridges between the people in terms of their outlook and their willingness to work together. With children, and we had a question about people who might be cognitively compromised. Getting feedback, I've found, is actually on the SRS much easier than with adults. As adults, we've been trained to be polite. Children quite often will tell you just how bad you are. At the same time, there are people who, when you go to fill out the ORS, may not be following the directions that are on the measure. How do I know that? Because their answers are reactive or responsive to the situation that happened just before they entered the room. So if they had a fight with their mother on the way into the therapy room or on the way to the therapy, very often the ORS score will be dramatically lower. With those folks in those situations, I'm going to have to do what we call process recall, meaning that I am going to take some time to get them in a reflective mindset before they answer the questionnaire. So if I can see that they're agitated, I'm going to say, take a deep breath for a second. When did we meet last? Oh, it was on Tuesday. What did you do after our visit? And Wednesday, what happened on Wednesday? What did you do over the weekend? What did you have for dinner last night? I'm getting them in a reflective mode, and then I give them the measure, which says to them, think back over the last week, including today, or since your last visit, and respond to the 4 items. I'm going to also do that with folks who might have cognitive limitations. I'm going to take some time to get them in a reflective mindset so that I'm getting something more than just how they feel at the moment. And again, one of the key things that you can look to for whether or not you're getting response in the moment rather than a reflection on the entire time between visits is the seesaw profile. I did want to answer an additional question, and that was by Craig Kindiger. And Craig asked about contraindications. And so first, let me just finish up this section about what the research and the research support for FIT says. We now have scores of RCTs, randomized controlled trials, not just about the ORS and SRS, but other measurement tools. They involve thousands of clinically, culturally, and economically diverse consumers that shows that doing routine outcome monitoring and responding to the feedback can as much as double the effect size of treatment. It reduces dropouts as long as you follow the feedback. It shortens the length of stay in treatment for people who are on track, and it reduces the overall cost of care. But is it useful for everyone? I can tell you so far that the majority of objections, and actually we have some research about this, come from therapists, not from clients. So therapists have loads of concerns about using the measures, asking for feedback, responding to client feedback in the moment. But despite the therapist's concerns about whether this is going to interrupt the therapy, get in the way of the therapeutic alliance, whether or not it's culturally appropriate, we haven't seen any research documenting that those are big concerns. Therapists, however, are concerned about them. That's something that would have to be addressed in your implementation. We can't just train the therapist and expect them to do it. They're going to have to be able to talk out those concerns that they have. But do we have research that suggests that there might be people that this is not useful for? So we have to admit that despite having scores of randomized controlled trials at the moment, we're still in the very early stages of research on routine outcome monitoring, or FIT. There are multiple studies, and you can see some of them listed here, that have found positive effects across a variety of contexts: outpatient, inpatient, and case management settings, and different kinds of issues and concerns. That is, traditional mental health concerns as well as substance abuse. We have evidence that FIT works in those settings. Early on, there was a study, actually a couple of studies, that seemed to indicate that FIT either had no effect or it didn't work with a particular population. The one study in the literature that found that it might be harmful was published by Kim de Jong out of the Netherlands. And she found that seeking feedback was associated with increased scores on the outcome measure, that is, worsening of client scores, with those diagnosed as cluster B personality disorder or with borderline features. But this particular study that has been talked about a great deal, the interpretation of it is not as straightforward as it might seem. First off, clients were mandated into a particular treatment program, and we know that mandated treatment needs to act differently with regard to the measurement tools, especially when clients are saying that they don't have a particular problem. So in other words, the feedback didn't change what they were doing in the room with clients. This is the same problem we saw in multiple studies that have found that FIT has made no impact. So for example, a study by Annika Davidson, a really cutting edge, fantastically done, rigorous study out of Denmark, looked at the use of FIT with people that had eating disorder problems. And at the end of the study, they found that FIT made no difference. But if you talk to the researcher, because she was really interested in, well, how could it not have an effect? Here's what she found in her follow-up. She found that clients were told that much of what they were asking for was not negotiable. So in their particular program, for example, part of the protocol was taking measurements of their weight, and clients could not refuse that. So even if their feedback was very negative about this, the clients were told that is a non-negotiable. If we can't respond to client feedback, it's just infuriating to ask for it and then ignore it. The same thing has happened in a number of studies where FIT has been implemented, and it's in the very early stages, within the first year or so that the study is done. As I said, the Brotland research shows us that it probably takes 2.5 to 4 years to implement successfully, to create that FIT culture at the agency. And as a result, what we're measuring in those studies when it hasn't seemed to work is more the stage of implementation than we are really anything about the process itself. So I hope that gets at your question, Lauren. We haven't found that clients raise objections. Most of those are therapist objections. I believe in a FIT culture, therapist objections would be taken seriously, discussed on your transition oversight group as part of the implementation, so that the clinician's concerns can be addressed. As far as research on particular clients, there was the one study, but I don't see tons of evidence that therapists can't ask for feedback from their clients in almost all circumstances and settings. Kay Barrett, thanks for joining us. And she asked about understanding the graphs in more detail. Again, this is something we really haven't talked about on prior FIT meetups, so I'm grateful that you asked. And The trajectories are an important part of fit. So first you have the administration of the measure, then the measures are plotted on a graph. What does this graph actually mean, and why is it different from just plotting it on my own? Yes, you can plot client progress, but what the graph allows you to do is get a client-specific prediction for success. And on the graph, the client is deemed on track if their score after the first visit, as you can see my cursor here move up the green line, if their score is at or above this green line from visit to visit, then their response is on track. They are making the amount of change they need to make to end treatment successfully. This is based on a sample of 500,000 completed cases of treatment. We've tested the trajectories across a number of different cultures and found no difference in how they operate. They're valid for both adults and kids. And the only way that you can get access to those trajectories is to use one of the authorized systems. And there are currently 3 systems that you can read about on my website. Just go to scottdmiller.com, look to the left, Fit Software, click on that and read through the various descriptions. 3 different systems, all of them offer free trials. My advice is try them all and see which one fits you. I have a general way of thinking about them. I think one is a bit more like an Apple product, one is a bit more like a Microsoft product, and the other is like a Linux system, more open. But you have to find the one that fits best for you. All of them use the same algorithms. Each one has just a slightly different way of interacting with the program. Is there an advantage to using the trajectories? Well, that is what fit is about, because therapists have a hard time determining actually on their own whether or not client progress is actually sufficient to be deemed on track. So take this client score on the slide you're seeing right now. It starts at a 13, and you'll see that green line. If a client scored here, which would be about a 17 or so, then that particular client would look like they had made progress at the second visit. The problem with that is that it's not a sufficient amount of progress to actually be on track. If the client is at or below the red line, then those clients are off track and on track to a negative or null outcome by the end of treatment. Critically, exposure to the graphs, the client scores against these norm trajectories, gives us an opportunity to have the conversation with the client about needing to change something about what we're doing, where it's being done, or who's doing it. Now, I've heard that some people have taken the measure and put it in something like SurveyMonkey. And I want to talk about that openly because the license that you agreed to when you downloaded the scales explicitly forbids you from making electronic or digital versions of the scales. So if you're doing that, you are violating the license of the measure. And it's just such a simple process. It's going to come in at much lower than you pay for your internet service at home to use one of these systems to guide your clinical work. So I hope you'll avail yourselves to them. But let's just talk about the graphs for a minute and what you do based on how clients respond to your work from visit to visit. Starting with clients who begin your work with them above the cutoff. So this is somebody who at the very first session starts 25 or higher. Now think about that. This is a client who's coming in and at their very first session, they say they're doing relatively well. They are not scoring like people who are in treatment. How do people in treatment score? The average intake score for clients in outpatient psychotherapy is 19. So if somebody comes in at 25 or higher, generally I'm going to score it, I'm going to show them the graph, and then I'm going to ask, what would bring you in today? Because your score indicates that you're doing relatively well. And after years of experience asking clients who score above the clinical cutoff, which in a regular outpatient practice is going to be between 25 and 33% of the people you see, what I found people say are one of 3 things. the first thing they say in clarifying why they're there and scoring so high is someone else sent me. So they're mandated into care. This is what I find with a lot of adolescents and kids who come to see me. They'll say, well, I'm fine, but my mom made me come in. The school teacher said I had to come and see and talk to you. If they're scoring high and someone else has sent them, this is the time to use a feature called the collateral score. By the way, all 3 software systems allow you to do this. That means you have the client complete the measure as if they are the person who mandated them into care. Now, please note, I did not say you have to go get that person's actual score, because the reason the client is there is because of how they perceive that significant other's concern in their life. So we're just merely capturing what we call this internal collateral score. So you start at 30 and I say, well, who sent you? My mother sent me. How would she score you? A 12. Now here's the gap in scores that Keith was asking about earlier. The client is saying their mother would rate them a 12, but the client says they're a 30. So how are you going to talk about that? I can tell you my bias based on my systemic background and my tendency to emphasize the positive rather than the negative. I'll say something like this. What is it you know about yourself that your mother doesn't yet know, or who hasn't seen or doesn't understand, that if she did understand or see, would make her scores similar to yours? This is just a systemically oriented question designed to understand the difference between the 2 scores. So that's the first way. Scores above the clinical cutoff, clients have been sent by somebody else. The second reason clients come in and they score high is because they're searching for help with a very specific problem. And that problem doesn't affect their overall sense of well-being. The classic example of this is phobias. Clients can have a phobia and be doing well in their relationships, in their work and social life, and even individually. What do you do in that particular case? You're probably going to need some other way to scale progress. And typically what I do is just use the scaling question specific to that client's problem. So you're afraid of spiders. On a scale of 1 to 10, how afraid are you? And then I'm going to look for change in that particular scale. At the same time, I'm administering the ORS to make sure that our work doesn't cause an overall deterioration in their functioning. Last but not least, and the third reason people sometimes score high is because they have just been released from another treatment facility, or they've had many treatment episodes with other therapists, and you are just the next one in line. In that particular case, they're actually doing relatively well. And if you look at the actual computer-generated trajectories with somebody who scores really high, the lines all point downward. In other words, this client's scores can deteriorate and they can still be on track. Since I want to minimize deterioration with somebody who's scoring high and doesn't have a specific problem and somebody else hasn't sent them, I'm going to adopt a strength-based approach. And I'm also going to begin spacing out the sessions as much as possible. Digging in this particular instance can increase the chances that the clients will get worse. One last little piece of information, and that is what to do in the case of a client's score indicating progress from session to session. So if you have a client who's in the red zone, we know that that's associated with higher dropout and no-show rates, or if it extends over time, the continued provision of ineffective services. So anytime you've got a client who's in the red zone, I'm going to have a conversation with him. And the latest possible point I'm going to do that is at the 3rd or 4th visit. As we've said earlier, by the 6th or 7th visit, if they're still in the red zone, I'm going to encourage the conversation about the frequency of the sessions. Do we need to see each other more or less? Do we need to add some service? Should we have you go to the group? Should we have you see our psychiatrist? Is there a self-help program that you might attend to? By 8 to 10 weeks, no change, and I'm wondering who else can treat them and whether another setting might be advisable. And here's what I'll tell my clients. I'll say, even if they're uncomfortable, I'll say, you know, clearly I'm not being helpful. I haven't been helpful from the start. You've stuck it out. I'm deeply appreciative. But I understand that transitioning to a new place or a new clinician can cause some anxiety. So I'm willing to go with you, even sit in your first visit with you to ensure a successful transition. Why are we doing this? Because we know that there is a dramatic attrition when the therapy is not working and the case is transferred to the next therapist. And I feel like it's my job as the clinician to ensure a continuity of care. That means I'm going to have to pay careful attention to the client and how they make it to that next treatment provider or next treatment setting. Cynthia, I see we're getting really up against the end of time, and there are several questions that I didn't get to. I'm feeling guilty about that.
So maybe folks could join us next time we do this.
Thanks everyone for joining us. And thank you, Cynthia, for helping out with all of the questions, etc.
No worries. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
If I search, will